Good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could please have your attention. Please take your seats. Well, good evening once again. My name is Rob Henkin, and I am the president of the Public Policy Forum. I would first of all like to extend my thanks and appreciation to all of you for being here, and of course for your steadfast support of the Public Policy Forum. You know, the daunting nature of my job is never more readily apparent than when I look out at a room like this, seeing a room filled with people of the stature of those individuals here, the people who guide and support our organization. Successful people, of course, have very high expectations for every organization they touch. Please be assured that we, both myself and the staff at the Public Policy Forum, take the responsibility to meet your standards very seriously, and that we will work even harder to produce meaningful results in return for the generosity that you have bestowed upon us. I am extremely fortunate at the Forum to be surrounded by an outstanding staff that also appreciates this responsibility and similarly cherishes the opportunity to work for Wisconsin's preeminent public policy think tank. I would like to recite their names and ask them to stand as I do so. First, Annalisa Dickman, our research director. Pam Matthews, membership and operations manager. Vanessa Allen, senior fiscal researcher. And the remaining members of our research staff, Jeff Schmidt, Joe Pietrangelo, Ann Chapman, and Davida Amenta. Please give these individuals a hearty round of applause. Before we get to our very exciting program, we wanted to share with you our new 100th anniversary video, which was skillfully and generously produced by Milwaukee Public Television and narrated by our resident historian, Jeff Bentoff. It is difficult to tell the story of a 100-year-old organization in only 8 minutes, but MPTV's Liddy Collins and her staff have succeeded in doing so. Please sit back and enjoy.
1913, the year the federal income tax came into existence. Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as the 28th U.S. president. Unemployment was 4.3%, and a first-class stamp was 2 cents. This was a time of change within government, business, and the nonprofit sector. Corruption was growing in government, and this brought about the efficiency movement. The movement resulted in the creation of bureaus to study how to make government more efficient. In Milwaukee, the first one was set up by the early socialists.
When the socialists were voted out, the bureau disappeared. But it was at that point that a number of business leaders looked at what that had done, looked at their own businesses that were beginning to talk about efficiency experts and things like that, and decided that they needed an efficiency organization on the outside. And that's how business became actually its first and primary sponsor, supporter. They set it up.
And it became the Milwaukee Citizens Bureau of Municipal Efficiency, and continues today as the Public Policy Forum, one of the oldest continuously operating independent research groups in the country.
It was intended to study government and to make suggestions for improvement in government. It's really interesting that so many of those early bureaus of efficiency, sometimes they were called municipal research bureaus, so many of those nonprofit bureaus really fell by the wayside. I think the Milwaukee Bureau survived because it really kept its focus on doing impartial research that was credible, that the newspapers agreed was impartial and nonpartisan, and making concrete recommendations.
Thomas Hinckley was the forum's first director, but under the long leadership of Norman Gill, the template was permanently set. The principles of impartiality, nonpartisanship, and providing sound, timely, and useful research created tremendous credibility for the organization.
Mr. Gill was fabulous at translating governmentese into English and why something was important. And for example, to read the reports that he issued, Anybody could read them. Anybody could understand them. He always made his points very clearly. So he was almost like a translator. He spoke in regular English, but he understood government English. America was changing, society was changing, Milwaukee was changing. It needed to change. And so it really shifted from being a kind of a rich man's anti-government, cut the cost of government, into a research bureau that did objective research, not hostile or adversarial, did not have a political philosophy that government was bad and the only good thing was to cut taxes. And the other thing they did is they broadened their base.
These recommendations brought about change, a change that resulted in the hiring of the first woman director, Jean Tyler. Under her tenure, the name changed from the Citizens Governmental Research Bureau to the Public Policy Forum. She created annual government awards, today known as a salute to local government.
The agenda of the forum is very heavily driven by what this community, meaning for us now, the greater metropolitan area, is looking at. What's in the newspaper? What are people concerned about? Where would information, in other words, be useful so that people could take it and could use it in some fashion? So there's always a moving agenda along with the staples of what are we spending, what are we getting for our government dollars.
David Meisner headed the forum when it was going through a reorganization. He renewed a focus on getting grants for research, and that research included controversial issues like school choice, regional transportation, gun violence and regulation, and housing discrimination in southeastern Wisconsin.
It was shifting from being a kind of a government reform and recommendations establishment to being much more of a research establishment. Much more, we'll give you the facts. We're not going to take sides. We don't have an ideology. But here are the facts. Everybody should make a decision based on the common set of facts. And so I think Dave Meisner deserves credit for helping navigate the Bureau between its old identity and its new identity.
Jeff Brown saw his role as director as trying to strengthen connections regionally in producing high-quality research to help governments make intelligent decisions.
We focused very heavily on regionalism, and the whole idea was to try to bring our region, which is really split apart, bring it together, to work together toward common goals, toward economic strength.
And today, on the 100th anniversary of the Public Policy Forum, the unbiased research continues.
What we have tried to do is take a detached, non-political, but expert look at the finances of our local governments, ranging from the county to the city to the sewerage district to the technical college system to, of course, Milwaukee Public Schools, and just try to lay out facts for policymakers and for citizens to describe in a very apolitical manner why they're facing the challenges they face and what some of their options are.
The Public Policy Forum doesn't advocate for specific legislation. It researches and presents the facts as a way to improve decision-making by government officials.
I think it's changed a bit in the sense that early on it was more a government watchdog. There was much more close monitoring of the operations of government. Now, I think that the Public Policy Forum looks at broader issues, and in addition to monitoring governmental entities and trying to assist them and make them better, it also looks at ongoing issues of a larger scope, tries to identify those issues, provide information on them, and help governmental entities solve those problems.
I think it's essential that we look at all policy issues with the facts. And too often we don't. We look at it through the prism of our own opinions or our prejudices. And I see the forum as an honest broker to really make sure that we're using the truth in order to make a decision. I use it as a business person to understand what's happening in my community.
I think that it's in everyone's interest, in all governmental entities in this region, to have a watchdog who's looking at the performance of government, who is providing nonpartisan, objective issue analysis, and who can act as a prompter to try and make sure that our community's resources are well spent and that government is operating efficiently.
It's not easy to remain objective. It's not easy to remain nonpartisan. It takes devoted people. It takes people with intellectual capacity to do great research. People who are willing to do it for less pay than maybe they might earn somewhere else. And the Public Policy Forum is fortunate enough to have a lot of those people and have had them over the years. We're one of the very, very few in the United States blessed to have someone like the Public Policy Forum acting on our behalf.
For the story on Milwaukee's Public Policy Forum, read Just the Facts, the 100-year history of Milwaukee's Public Policy Forum by Jeff Bentoff.
Thank you once again to Milwaukee Public Television for producing such a wonderful video. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce our program. Planning for this gala dinner was initiated 18 months ago by a special committee of Forum trustees chaired by Susan Hatch and Andy Schiesel. Our mission was to come up with a nationally recognized guest speaker who would be interesting, provocative, and appropriately reflect who the Forum is and what we do. After months of tossing around ideas, we settled on a pair of speakers, national columnists and public affairs show commentators David Brooks and E.J. Dionne, who appear together on a weekly Friday afternoon segment on National Public Radio's All Things Considered. What distinguishes these two gentlemen from other political commentators is that when they get together to discuss politics and policy, they do so in a calm, insightful, and methodical manner. Instead of anecdote, hyperbole, and invective, we get reasoned discourse and astute historical perspective. Yes, Mr. Brooks and Mr. Dionne do dispute one another, but they do so with civility. And whichever side the listener may be on, it's likely that he or she comes away appreciating that it is possible for thoughtful and intelligent people to respectfully disagree. Reasoned, civil, methodical. Those are words that we like to think have characterized the Forum's mission since its inception. We are so pleased to bring David Brooks and E.J. Dionne to Milwaukee to highlight that mission and celebrate 100 years of fact-based, informed public policy debate. Our moderator for tonight's program is a local public radio celebrity, Mitch Teich. Since 2006, Mitch has been the executive producer of WUWM's weekday magazine program, Lake Effect. Mitch, thank you for being here this evening to moderate our program, and thanks to WUWM for being a media sponsor. Please take it away.
Well, thanks, Rob. It is an honor to share the stage with our two guests tonight. We have a lot to talk about, but before we get started, I want to invite you to start thinking of your own questions now and be ready with them. The second half of tonight's conversation will be driven by you. But first, David Brooks and E.J. Dionne, the theme for this evening's event is a century of civility, which seems incredible considering there are events today in which even 100 seconds of civility would be appreciated. But what the two of you do on a regular basis in the New York Times and the Washington Post and on NPR and any other broadcast media could really be considered the epitome of civil discourse. You're both opinionated people. So what is it about your relationship that makes it possible for you to have these public conversations about very emotional, very charged issues without raising your voice?
Well, we actually secretly hate each other, but we're good actors. Well, I have a rule of who I'll be on with. I'm on NPR with E.J., and I'm on a show called The News Hour on PBS with Mark Shields. So I appear only with Catholics from Massachusetts, and that works for me. E.J. and I have been long friends. Mark and I have been long friends. Mark has been doing the News Hour for a long time now. Our segment is called Shields and Brooks. We wanted to call it Brooks Shields, but they wouldn't allow that. And before that, it was Shields and Chigot and Shields and Gergen. And then before that, it was Shields and Coolidge. And it started out as Shields and Thomas Aquinas, I think. And E.J. and I have known each other for a long time. And we met, well, probably through work, but we have a lot in common. Baseball, We both have sons who played pretty serious baseball, and we used to commune over that. We're similar height. That's important. I'm not sure how. Mostly it's just, when you're going to argue with somebody, first you want to like them. You want to have a relationship. And then you want to, I used to be a liberal, and I can talk about why I came to my senses later, but you want to have some respect and know that politics is basically a competition between half-truths, and each side probably has a piece of it. My side is just a little larger.
E.J. Dionne.
First, I just want to say it's great to be here in Milwaukee, to be back in Milwaukee, a city with such a great socialist tradition. I hope some of that rubs off on David while he's here. I guess I want some of it to rub off on Governor Walker, too, now that I think about it. And by the way, Dan Hohn's grandson is in the room. It's an honor to have you here. Two other things I want to say about Milwaukee. One is your mayor, Tom Barrett. I got to know Mayor Barrett back in the 90s. And how I got to know him is because, and it goes to civility, many of you remember the Clinton impeachment hearings, which were not one of the highest moments in our country's history. And there was this guy, Tom Barrett, whom I had never met, who was actually a consistently reasonable person. And I called him up, and I discovered that we had lunch, and I discovered we had a lot in common. We both got married as old guys, and we had our children at almost exactly the same moment, although he one upped me with a fourth child. But it's great to be with him. It was also great to meet Chris Abele, your county executive. I love the idea of this as a progressive organization. This shows why, on the civility question, David and I both love Theodore Roosevelt. David loves him because he's a conservative. I love him because he's a progressive, which probably proves that both of us are wrong. I think I honor the Gill family in the room, and it does reflect the fact this organization reflects something that doesn't happen that much, and it's something David and I talk about, which is facts matter in public policy, but they don't seem to matter so much in the debate right now, and I think David and I sort of share a sense that at least we ought to share, some sort of basic agreement on what the facts are, and then we can beat each other's heads in. Also, by the way, I can't resist mentioning Rick White. Doesn't that guy have an incredible radio voice? I discovered, and I discovered that he once did radio, but you got a new career someday as the voice of the Brewers. So we will. But just on a last point on David and me, I grew up actually in a conservative family, although my family became more liberal over time. I once inscribed a book to David's mother, which said, "Who raised a wonderful son and has much better politics than he does." But I always like to say that I grew up in a very argumentative extended family. And so I can literally say I deeply loved people I passionately disagreed with. And you don't have that much. And one of the favorite things that's happened to me is I had a dear Uncle Ray, and he and I spent 35 years arguing about politics. And his kids, my cousins, were kind enough to ask me to do the eulogy. And I made a point in the eulogy of quoting Richard Nixon. And it was a Nixon quote I actually liked, but I looked at the people in the room and said, the other reason I quoted Nixon is because I was hoping Uncle Ray would come back to life, rise up out of the casket, and point to me and say, "I knew you'd be quoting Nixon someday." And I just think that there is a sort of an odd degree of hatred in our politics now. And look, I can get very polemical, and I can get angry myself, so I don't pretend to be an angel on any of these things, but there is just something about not understanding the possibility that somebody might have a different view from you. And I think that's sort of what brings David and me together, even though he's wrong on most things.
Well, and you talk about friendship, and you talk about youth baseball, and I wonder if you're onto something here. Not everyone has kids in youth sports, but at the heart of things, there are commonalities that tie us together that are maybe overlooked. We tend to think of each other as proxies for liberal or conservative, and not proxy for woodworker or jogger or bowler. I mean, is there something about not even being interested in getting to know each other anymore?
Could I just say real quick on that? One of the
It's already interrupting me.
Yeah. One of the issues I think we most agree on, we both share an interest in community. We discovered maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that we both liked a conservative writer called Robert Nisbet, who wrote a book called The Quest for Community. And David's politics are closer to Nisbet's politics than mine are, but there is this sense that, communitarianism, it's not a great word, but it's a great idea. And I think that David has a communitarian streak in his conservatism, and I have a communitarian streak in my liberalism. Go ahead, David.
First, most of us in the course of our lives have shifted. So you're aware of other positions because you used to hold them. As E.J. mentioned, my parents were not quite, but pretty left-wing. I remember in 1965, they took me to this be-in. I told this story, E.J.'s probably heard it. I was 5. A be-in was where hippies would go just to be. In New York, and
most of this audience experienced that.
Probably, if you were in Madison, I guarantee it. So the hippies took their wallets out and they threw it into a burning trash can, and to demonstrate their liberation from money and material things. And I was 5 years old, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the trash can. So I broke from the crowd, reached into the fire, grabbed the money, and ran away. And that was my first step over to the right, but it took a little while. And I actually am, I should say, since E.J.'s currying local favor, I am a member of one completely socialist organization. I am a co-owner of the Green Bay Packers. But I would say one thing to your question. Tom Wolfe was once asked, what's the most important thing that happened in your lifetime? And he said, oh, that's easy, co-ed dorms. And I think what he meant by that was that the decisions politicians make have huge effects on how we live. But really the most important effects are changes in community, changes in morality, changes in attitudes. It's about sociology and psychology and romance. And if you take politics as a small piece of life, then it's hard to have an absolutist hatred towards somebody when you probably share things in these other realms.
Well, to continue with this evening's be-in, we're also in this stage of our history when anyone can be a pundit and have a nationally heard voice. When all of us started in this business and someone had a complaint about something that we said or we wrote, they had to either haul out a typewriter or their stationery and write a letter and fold that letter and find the address and put a stamp on the envelope and whisk it off. Now the feedback is instant through Facebook, the comment section of websites. Does seeing the plethora of comments make either of you more sensitive to people who disagree with your opinions?
Well, many of the comments you see under columns could not be repeated before this polite audience. I mean, one of my favorites actually began, "Dear Mr. Dionne, are you as dumb in person?" And so you may get nothing else out of my comments tonight, but you'll be able to answer that question for yourself. And I have very kind of complicated views on this new world. On the one side, I welcome the new world because there is a real diversity of opinion out there. You have access to material and opinion that you didn't have before. You can read newspapers from all over the country and all over the world. You can read opinion, depending on how many languages you speak, you can read opinion from all over the place. And it does give access to new voices quickly who don't have to rise up through established organizations. And I think all of that is good. And I also think the new media tend to be mobilizing rather than demobilizing. I think one of the problems with the older media is that the desperate effort not to be partisan often pushed them into a place where bipartisanship meant, well, both sides are equally bad. And that doesn't exactly mobilize people to activism. So I think all that's for the good. I think the ability to have all kinds of anonymous opinion, I mean, there is kind of, it's more the id that speaks when somebody throws out an angry, often, obscene comment. My other favorite, by the way, was your mother was a lesbian biker. And a friend of mine said I should have written back simply, "How did you know?" But, you know, there is something about that. And obviously, you know, pretty wacky points of view can get agglomerated to look like a larger movement. And then we've always had, thank God, we're a free country, we've always had some pretty wacky views, but wacky movements can now look much larger because they can conglomerate together. And again, I honor the freedom of people to do that, but I think it can distort the discussion.
Yeah. I would say the first 6 months of my current job were among the roughest 6 months of my life, because I'd never been hated on a mass scale before. And after those 6 months, I deleted my email folder, and there were 290,000 in there. And our audience is pretty left-wing, and the core message of them was, Paul Krugman is great, you suck. That was the core. And so I thought, I've got to read through them all so I can know my audience, so I can learn from them. And occasionally, there's a really smart comment. Yeah. But it became too psychologically debilitating. And so I had to ask my assistant to read it, and then he got too depressed. And so a lot of the
comments... So he gave them to me, and I loved every one.
And so a lot of the comments, some are really intelligent. A lot are about status. Why do you have a column when I don't? So there's a lot of that. And so it's tough to wade through it all. I guess two final comments on technology. To me, the biggest effect of technology is we used to have these... say you were covering a presidential campaign, you would ride around with the candidates in the buses or in the vans for hour upon hour with off-the-record just chit-chat, and you would really get to know them super well. Now, because everybody has a phone or a camera on the back of their phone, that off-the-record time is almost gone. And so the transparency of the media has led to opaqueness. The transparency of the technology led to opaqueness. The final thing to be said is, my sense, if you had asked me how our business was doing a few years ago, I thought we were the whaling industry. We were just in collapse. But now I think there's been a bit of a flight to quality. So if E.J. and we see each other at meetings with the president, we have lunches and dinners with Congress people, E.J. had an interview with the mayor. So if we write that somebody is thinking this, it's because they told us. If some of the bloggers, sometimes I'll be reading a political blog, and it'll seem smart, and then the blogger will say, well, I got to go now. I've got to go off to junior high. And I realized I've been reading a 12-year-old. So some of them are just speculating. And so I think there's a bit of a flight toward actual reporting.
Well, let's talk specifically about Wisconsin, which I think we can agree has been the model of civility. This state, along with Ohio and Indiana to a degree, has been at the leading edge of what seems to be a growing political will to take on public workers and public worker unions. First of all, what do you see as the ripple effect nationally from the politics that has played out in Wisconsin, particularly since Scott Walker became governor?
Go ahead, David. Yeah,
E.J. wants the rebuttal position on this one.
That's absolutely right.
No, after you, Alphonse. You know, I guess I would say one of the things that's been striking to me is that each generation has an incentive to spend money on itself and make promises to itself and push the costs onto future generations. And no generation has done it to the extent that we have. And I have theories about that, or why we've done that, but in two ways we've made huge spending on ourselves, huge promises to ourselves, and pushed the costs on others. And that's through deficit spending on the federal level, and that's often through state pension spending on the local level. And so to me, that is a legitimate big problem. It is also a problem that is going to take decades to get out from under. And therefore, as you're doing the problem, solving it, you have to acknowledge that the other party exists. And you have to find a way to respect that they are going to exist, that they're going to be in power, and that if you're going to try to set a series of bipartisan policies, you have to acknowledge you want some continuity from party to party. So you have to think in terms of bipartisanship. So I totally understood why Walker went after some of these issues. I think it's essential for governance in the future. It's going to be essential in Illinois. It's essential in California, state after state. You have to go after these unaffordable pensions, which are just sucking up money from everything else. But where I differed from the approach I saw here was that you got to create a long system that's going to work across parties, and I thought he was needlessly confrontational.
E.J. Dionne, is it that it's a problem at all, or is it the aim that was taken to the problem that resulted in what it did?
Well, I think you can sort of sense some of the differences in the way David and I look at the world by where he began his discussion, which is that the central problem is with the deficits and looking to the next generation. And I think the central problem for the next generation is the lack of economic growth and the rise of a kind of radical inequality, where we have gone back after a period of narrowing inequalities, a long period of narrowing inequalities in our country. Inequality has grown steadily since 1973, and we became, we were about as unequal on the eve of this great recession as we were on the eve of the Great Depression. I don't think that's entirely accidental. Therefore, when I look at what happened here in Wisconsin, my view of unions is fundamentally positive. Because I think when you look at how we became a great middle-class nation, unions played a very large role in that. They played a very large role in guaranteeing a decent level of life for people who worked in blue-collar jobs. And so I had an instinctive reaction against the direct frontal attack on unions. I would agree with David, for example, that pension costs are a problem for a lot of states. I think the real cause of that is that a lot of politicians found it easier to put money in pensions that were hidden in the future than to give public employees direct raises, and that was a problem in both parties, and now we have to come to terms with that. But when you look at Wisconsin, as if I'm right, that Bill 10 excluded cops and firefighters. And here in Milwaukee, I think 69% of pension costs are in for police and fire. And I honor police and firemen, firefighters, but that seems more political than it does a real attack on the problem. And the politicians I admired in the downturn were the ones who, were willing to make cuts necessary, but also willing to raise taxes because they didn't want to do it all in cuts. Governor Malloy in Connecticut is somebody I've looked to as somebody who did a whole bunch of unpopular things on both sides, rather than simply go at spending. And I think it's the job of politicians to negotiate with public employees rather than to try to take them on by force. And so I found, I would have been clearly on the other side of this fight here in Wisconsin.
The fight vaulted the former Milwaukee County executive turned governor onto the national political stage. Many are describing him as a national political contender now. What is your assessment of where Scott Walker falls in the Republican presidential or potentially vice presidential field in 2016?
I think it's not out of the question in the sense that he does have a lot of sympathy on the Republican right. Just the enemy or your enemy is your friends, and a lot of people on the right these days dislike unions. But I also think that some of it will depend on the mood of the party, because a certain amount of a kind of confrontational right has not seemed to help them in presidential elections. And another thing I find curious that I've learned about is this effort to have state law tell localities that they have to get rid of their residency requirements. It just seems odd for a conservative to tell Brown Deer or Milwaukee or La Crosse that they can't do something that was traditionally allowed, and not to mention taking those property taxes out for people who collect public pensions. And so I think when you're a governor, I picked that one issue. Being governor is great preparation for a presidential campaign. It can also be disastrous because you've got to defend an entire record. And Mitt Romney couldn't defend his greatest achievement as governor. He should have embraced health care in Massachusetts, and he couldn't. So there's a real challenge these days, and I think some of it is the media environment, to being a governor and going on the national stage.
Yeah. I would say it's harder to be, to get the nomination, it's easier to be a governor. Between John Kennedy and Barack Obama, 61 senators ran for president, and their record was 0 for 61. And I used to tease them, why do you guys all lose? And they would say, well, we take tough votes. But the reality was, and this was given to me by one of the senators who ran for president, is we're United States senators. We don't like staying in the Motel 6 in Pocahontas, Iowa. And they're sort of puffed up and distant. And if you're a mayor or a governor, you actually do talk about issues that are concrete and real. And so I still think governors have an advantage. Nonetheless, when I look at the presidential candidates at this early stage, I just look at them like a pitching scout. You just look at their stuff. Who throws the best fastball? Who throws the best curveball? Who has the best speaking style? Who has the most charisma? Who's best one-on-one? And so my exterior view, and I've met Walker a few times, is that he doesn't have as good stuff as a lot of the others. Marco Rubio seems to be a better politician. Paul Ryan seems to be a better politician. Just who's good? And I would put him in the middle of the pack.
Maybe he could reinvent himself as a knuckleballer, though.
We have a lot of knuckleheads. I don't know if we have.
Just by the way, I think the other problem that senators have is that it almost seems that you lose the capacity to speak English if you spend too much time in Congress. And you can think of classic mistakes like I voted for the $87 billion before I voted against it. It made absolute sense in terms of what John Kerry did and how the Senate works. But a sentence like that did not obviously work very well in the rest of the country.
Just want to give our audience members a heads up. I'm going to ask probably a couple more questions. Maybe 5 minutes from now, you can start to raise your hands to be recognized for some audience-driven Q&A. And I think we'll bring the house lights up at that point, or we'll squint a lot. Let me ask this question, speaking of the economy, as sequestration's effects find their way further and further into people's lives, who stands to pay a political price as we head toward the midterm elections? Or do they hold sway next November?
Well, I mean, first of all, the biggest problem with sequestration, there was a very good piece in the New York Times today on how foolish the policies we are now following are. The Times piece, if you didn't see it, said that austerity, kind of pulling back at this moment, has probably bumped the unemployment rate up by close to a full point. That's a lot of people without work who don't have to be without work. We're not out of the woods yet on the economic crisis. We are growing. It's better than it was. But we should be doing all we can to speed growth along. There's a time to address deficits, but it's not when you're still coming out of an economic mess. And the sequester just contributes to that, and not to mention creating particular problems. And it's, I found it disturbing that, the flight delays hurt people who can afford plane tickets, so we'll fix that. But we're not going to fix Meals on Wheels, and we're not going to fix cutting Head Start, and we're not going to fix the cut for the unemployed. There's just something fundamentally wrong with that. But whether you agree with that or not, even if you don't agree with that, the policy of cutting at this moment is just a terrible idea. The problem is, I don't know if there is going to be a big price paid, because I think the Republicans they believe in cuts, and they made a calculation that in the end, a slowing economy is likely to hurt the president and therefore the Democrats. And I think a lot depends on how these issues are argued between now and then. The president gave a big speech in Austin today. I think he's got to bring us back to the larger debate over what it takes to build an economy. And some of that does involve, and I know I'm not using it as a euphemism for spending, investment, including investment in infrastructure for the long haul. That's one issue David and I actually agree on. And so I think a lot depends on how the issue is framed. But I think the sequester itself has not hurt the Republicans as people expected, and slow growth might hurt the president.
Well, here's where we disagree. We've been borrowing $1 trillion a year plus for 5 years now. We're still borrowing close to $1 trillion a year. If this was austerity, I don't know what non-austerity looks like. We're just borrowing a lot of money.
Yeah, except the deficit is down much lower than that now.
Yeah, we're still, historically, the deficits are hugely high. And so I think if you take a look at the growth levels and the spending levels, there's really little correlation. Obviously, government spending creates some growth. I think the effect of that is remarkably weak and depends a lot on the psychology of the country at any given time. I think the sequester is too small an effect to have much an effect on economic growth in an economy, whatever it is, a $14 trillion economy. Nonetheless, I hate the sequester. It was designed to be stupid policy, and this is one thing Washington did magnificently well. It is extremely stupid policy. And I hate it because it does none of what you want. I mean, to me, what I want to do, and let's talk about something E.J. mentioned earlier tonight, which is he mentioned the inequality, and I agree that is a gigantic problem. I think we have two gigantic problems facing the country on the economic front. One is the rising inequality across educational lines. One is rising debt. And so to me, the way you deal with both those problems simultaneously is spend a lot more on discretionary spending now, on Head Start, on infrastructure, on early childhood programs, on all sorts of job training programs, and then do entitlement reform by means testing Medicare and other things over the long term. In other words, we have a government that's a giant machine for taking money from struggling families and giving it to affluent seniors. And what we should do is have a whole series of policies to take money from affluent seniors and give it to struggling families. And so to me, you can sort of solve both those problems. The sequester magnificently does the opposite. It cuts all the domestic programs that go to struggling families. It doesn't touch Medicare, basically. And so it hurts all the wrong people. It helps all the wrong people. And it makes our government much more like the kind of government you would have if your nation is in decline, spending on the present and not on the future.
Well, and let me ask you a question that might be a follow-up, really, to this, and that is when you look back at the budget showdown of last year and how it resulted in the sequester and the immigration reform effort going on right now and the gun control compromise that wasn't, what do all these battles say about the state of political leadership circa 2013?
Well, first of all, I just want to go back at David on one thing. I mean, broadly, I am sympathetic to the idea of transferring some resources from the wealthy to families who need them. I think that there's this notion that if there are all of these millionaires hanging around in country clubs collecting Medicare and Social Security, most of the spending on the elderly goes to elderly people who really need it. And a lot of the problem is not the elderly, it's rising healthcare costs. And the good news there is we may actually be succeeding in bringing down healthcare costs for the longer term. And if we can do that, a lot of these other problems become much easier to solve. But again, this is probably an area where David and I disagree. I think that there are some savings to be had in those programs, but I don't think they're as great as David says because there just aren't that many rich elderly people to take this money from. But in terms of the word leadership, I think we almost use it as a totemic word, and I have a suspicion that every generation says our leaders today are not what they used to be. I imagine there were people saying, oh, this guy, Lincoln, it was much better when we had Andrew Jackson, this big war happened after we elected Lincoln. So I think there's a tendency, there's a kind of nostalgia in this. I see it fundamentally as the product of a Republican Party that has moved far to the right of where it used to be, and a conservatism that has radicalized. And I think you see that and I think there's a structural problem for Republicans because a lot of the people who were more moderate or even moderately conservative Republicans have left the party. I sometimes joke that if you want to blame the polarization on anyone, blame it on Bill Clinton, because that's when a lot of these Republicans started leaving in places like the suburbs of Philadelphia and the suburbs of Chicago. Or why did Christine I am not a witch O'Donnell beat Mike Castle, one of the most respected members of Congress, in a primary? And the answer was all the kinds of Republicans who used to vote for Mike Castle left the Republican Party. And so and I think you see that on guns, you see that on the budget issues, where it becomes impossible to have cuts and tax increases to get to fiscal balance. And I think what you need is a more moderate form of conservatism And I think it sometimes takes several elections. I mean, I'd vote the other way from David Cameron in Britain, but it's a reasonable form of conservatism. But it took the Tories a lot of elections to get there. They had to lose a bunch of elections before they got to get David Cameron. And even though I'm not a fan of his budget policies, he is a reasonable, middle-of-the-road kind of conservative. And I think you need a different kind of conservatism.
Well, I mean, just quickly, I think the Democrats have moved to the left as the Republicans have moved to the right. We could cite studies, but we will bore you and even each other. But let me talk a little about Washington, because I do think we have a man named Manker Olson wrote a great book on why nations decline, and it's because institutions grow up around government and clog everything up. And now we have a whole series of institutions that have grown up around government, whether it's the AARP or the NRA, which have effective veto power in their areas. And it just makes it hard to do deals, or whether it's the Club for Growth or Grover Norquist tax reform, they have veto power. And so it's become much harder to do deals on anything. It's also become true that if you have a broad compromise coalition defending a messy bill that none of them actually love, it's much easier for a small minority to beat that broad, messy coalition than for the messy coalition to win. And so that's another feature of our politics. But fundamentally, one of the questions about polarization is it a Washington thing or is it a national thing? And I confess I've gone back and forth. I'm beginning to think it's more a national thing, and the politicians are responding rationally to the incentives in front of them. And that if the country is hiving off into liberals moving to liberal areas, conservatives moving to conservative areas, very few swing areas anymore. And E.J. wrote today about the Mark Sanford race, which, a Republican was just going to win that seat. He could have gone on the Appalachian Trail 6 days from Sunday. He was going to win that seat. So if the country is truly dividing, which I think it is, then you can't blame the politicians. And if we want more government than they're willing to pay for, you can't blame them for the deficit either.
And we used to talk about this in the Reagan years. Somebody once said that in the Reagan years, we elected Democrats to Congress to get what we wanted and Republicans to the White House so we wouldn't have to pay for it. And there is, I do agree with David on the polarization being it's not just leaders, it's not just interest groups. I think it really has penetrated the country. You saw it here in Wisconsin. I mean, this is a state, in a way, the Tommy Thompson years versus the Scott Walker years were quite different, even though you had two Republican governors here. And I think that might be emblematic of the transformation we're talking about. On guns, I think there's an outdated view on where power is on guns. I heard Bill Clinton give a speech last week where he had a wonderful classic Bill Clinton metaphor. And he said that, when a cat jumps on a hot stove and burns itself, the cat will never jump up on the stove again, even when the stove has cooled. And I think what's happened is a lot of politicians on guns still think the stove is hot, still think all the power is on the side of the NRA. In fact, I think the stove has cooled, and I think you have energy on the other side. And I am quite persuaded that that's going to come up for the background checks are going to come back and we'll have a decent chance, because the senators who got the heat, to continue with a thermal metaphor, the senators who got the heat were the ones who voted against background checks, which I think surprised a lot of people, including those senators.
Do we have questions ready to go in the audience yet?
This is a very unopinionated crowd. There's no views in this room.
I think I see one over there.
We need visors, brewers' visors.
E.J. and David, first of all, thank you for coming to Milwaukee. This is terrific. I hope you'll come back. We love having you. David, if I could direct a question to you. I admire your writing so much and your perspective. Who do you read? Who do you follow? Who else would you recommend to some of us that want more of David Brooks' opinions?
There's nobody like David Brooks.
You want people like me, Lincoln, Tolstoy, Shakespeare? I read the Washington Post editorial page some days before my own. Let's cover my microphone when I say that. One of the things I do is I think we're in a golden age of long-form journalism. And so 2 websites I would recommend to you, what they do is they provide links to essays. And one is called The Browser, and the other is called Arts and Letters Daily. And some are political, a lot are non-political. But my view is read the longest possible thing you have time for, because you won't remember short stuff, but if you read a long thing that you invest some time in, you'll remember it and it'll have an impact. And the second thing, I spent a lot of time in universities reading academic studies and literature. And I find that gives you some added value. If you're going to write for a living, none of us are smart enough to come up with interesting opinions. You got to bring some information to the table. And then the final thing, I'd say this to students all the time, just for writing style. There are 2 great writers who I read just to get the clarity of the simplicity of prose in my head, and that's George Orwell and C.S. Lewis. Both happen to be English mid-century, 20th century writers, but they could take the most complicated subjects and make it seem so reasonable. And their prose style is just a thing of beauty. And I go back to them just to get that model in my head.
Do we have another question?
Sorry. Thanks. Thank you for coming tonight. You know, you talked a lot about the partisanship, but I wonder, historically, we're coming into the latter part of the second term of a presidential administration. And one of the things that we hear a lot about is the grand bargain. Do you think that until the end of President Obama's term, will there be any sort of a grand bargain? What issue or issues will it occur on, and who will midwife it?
First of all, just to go back to the question you asked way at the beginning, I really love George Orwell and C.S. Lewis too, and so there is there are these, and those are not obvious choices, I think. Orwell maybe. I don't think there'll be a grand bargain. There might be a less than grand bargain. But I think the pressure may have come off that as the deficit comes down. What my understanding of what the administration thinks is they still think that they could pick up 5 Republicans in the Senate, perhaps, to agree to some kind of deal that would cut the deficit enough to get us through quite a few years forward. It's why President Obama continues to have golf games and dinners with Republican senators. And I think as you watch carefully which ones he's picking, because I think you're going to narrow the group down to a rather limited number of Republican senators. And then the question is, and so that would involve some tax reform, sort of chipping away at tax benefits rather than sort of sweeping them away. For example, having everybody get tax or all the tax deductions, but only up to a 28% level, stuff like that. With possibly some, Obama's put some Medicare cuts on the table that I think most Democrats could accept. I think a bargain of that sort is possible, but the House is a very peculiar place right now, and John Boehner doesn't really control the House. I'm not sure anybody controls the House. And we mentioned immigration reform, which we didn't really answer. I think there's a little bit more of a chance than David does on immigration reform. But in the House, I think that the Republican Party's interest is in immigration reform, because they can't have another election where their presidential candidate gets only 27% of the Latino vote, loses the Asian vote by a large margin. But I think the interest of individual House members is at odds with the interest of the party, because in their districts, opposition is a much safer position. And so I think that's true of the vast majority of the House. Now, if you could have coalitions between most of the Democrats and 40 to 80 Republicans, you could get a lot of stuff done. But John Boehner would lose his speakership if that kept happening. And so that's the problem. That's the problem. I think there is a moderate coalition that could run the House, but it can't, it can't do it under the current circumstances.
David Brooks, is there a grand bargain in the offing?
Nope.
All right, next question.
There isn't. I think we need one in 2019, according to the president's budget. We're going to be spending $850 billion a year on interest payments on the debt. Just interest payments alone, we'll be spending more on interest payments than on the Pentagon. And so to me, that's crazy. That's unaffordable. Let alone, how's the Fed going to raise interest rates in those circumstances if it needs to? And so I think we need one, but I think the political will is gone, and the relationships aren't there, and the underlying structure isn't there. And I just want to, I do think immigration reform is the key issue of the year. If the Republicans defeat immigration reform, it will be like the party committing suicide. I really think they will sentence themselves to a long period of minority status. And I think there's at least a 50-50 chance they may do that. And so to me, that's the issue to watch this year, if the Republicans are responsible for defeating this thing.
So you don't want to go back to the question about political leadership at this point?
Well, I agree with E.J. that if you're from an area of the country where your constituents are wildly think there's too much immigration, it costs too much, it's lowering wages, then your interests are to vote against it, even if it destroys your future presidential candidates.
There's a question about 2/3 of the way back in the middle.
Good evening, Mayor. John Dickert from Racine, Wisconsin. First of all, I want to thank you for your conversation and the tenor of it, because it's long overdue. With the amount of money that is in politics right now, it doesn't seem like it's going to go anywhere fast. Is the electorate the only thing that's really going to change Washington?
Oh, I want the rebuttal position on this one.
Okay, you run for office, and I've asked this question of millions of people, not millions, but many people who run for office, and no one agrees with me, but the political scientists agree with me, which is that the power of money in actually shaping votes is reasonably limited. The Koch brothers spent a lot of money trying to influence votes to no discernible effect. If you're spending, say in a Senate race in Colorado, say, you're spending $40 million per candidate, and the viewers are watching 30 ads every couple hours, 29 of those ads are just making the rubble bounce. They're doing absolutely nothing. I think what moves voters is when neighbors come to their homes and talk to them. I think nothing else moves voters. So I think money is vastly overrated as a influential force in politics. Unfortunately, no politician I know agrees with me on that. So they all think it has a lot of influence, so they all do things to try to raise money. And so I do think the money has an effect because it's given an effect. And I do also think it has an effect on what issues get raised. So I'm not a big believer that money has a big effect. What will change Washington? Well, we have history here. Movements change Washington. Whether it's the Goldwater movement, the McGovern movement, the Tea Party movement, outside movements change Washington and change American history. So it's really up to spontaneous decisions of populist people to band together and create a movement that shifts the political atmosphere. In our history, very few other things other than mass movements and extremely smart columnists have had huge historical effects.
And for the long-awaited rebuttal?
I totally agree on that last point. I would love David to run for office and spend no money and see what happens.
No, up to a threshold. Once you hit that threshold.
Yeah, I thought that's what David would say, which is why I wanted to come second. I think that there are a number of problems with the money. Problem one is who politicians spend their time with, because the system encourages politicians to spend a whole lot of time with very, very privileged people. And I think it distorts their vision over time of what the country is like. There is very little incentive for a politician to spend time with a lot of poor single mothers, a lot of people who lost their jobs in factories. And so I think that incentive effect is bad. I think secondly, the money, sort of when all of the money or most of the money comes from people who have particular interests before Washington, it shifts policy. And so, yes, on social issues, you got plenty of money on both sides because there were rich social liberals and rich social conservatives, and they can fight. But try to look around tax committees and regulatory committees. And most of the money comes from people with very clear personal or corporate interests before those committees. And it begins to have an effect over time. And there are a lot of votes that people don't notice. And that's why our hero, Teddy Roosevelt, was one of the first advocates of campaign finance reform. And it's why I still find the Citizens United decision shocking, because it really overthrew over 100 years of tradition. When we first said that money will always influence outcomes in a capitalist democracy, what we're trying to do is limit money's writ, is to at least keep it under some control. And that decision has just taken all of the controls off, and we are back to where we were, in effect, before 1906. That doesn't feel like progress to me.
I know the hour is getting late, but we'll take a couple more questions anyway. One from all the way in the back.
I'd like to thank you again for being here tonight to help us celebrate. If I may, can I ask you to represent the East Coast intellectual elites for a moment?
That's a stretch, but go ahead.
I'm opposed to the East Coast intellectual elite.
Well, to the extent that those people contemplate Milwaukee, Wisconsin, what do they think of us?
Well,
Was Laverne and Shirley said here? Do I have that right?
Yes. We were just told tonight that you are the seventh greatest city in terms of the arts in the country. Somebody said that this was on a yeah.
So I think we were rated the 7th most exciting city in America.
Yeah, right. So that's what the East Coast elites will think now. You know, it's funny you asked that question, because I was talking to David when we were coming in from the airport, and in the book that you got from me, you will find a sort of several paragraphs in which I attack anyone who ever uses the term flyover country. And I attack it. It's a term I hate, because David and I both have spent a lot of time in the Midwest, and both like the Midwest and like the way people are and like the civic spirit. And in the book, I've specifically argued that any, to use your term, East Coast liberal elites who say that, forget that the whole progressive and populist impulse came from that part of the country that some people, not us, call flyover country. This was the cradle of progressivism, the state of Wisconsin. Nebraska was a cradle of populism. Minnesota, the Dakotas, the nonpartisan league. And so, I think the biggest problem for a lot of the people you're talking about is they haven't spent enough time in the Midwest. They haven't spent a lot of time in the middle of the country. I mean, one last thing. When I graduated from college, my roommate and I threw a tent in the back of his Chevy and spent 2.5 months discovering America. And we went everywhere. We saw Elvis live. We went to Woody Guthrie's hometown. We went to the Cascades. We visited the River Rouge plant in Detroit. We went all over the country. And we wanted to create a fellowship to let kids do this when they got out of college. And the only requirement of the fellowship would have been that you had to spend 2/3 of your time away from the two coasts. And someday I'd still like to endow that fellowship.
Yeah. I would say, we're pretty, even with the global economy and global information, people are pretty local. And so there's an immense amount of ignorance. I created a quiz for my first book. If you're living on the East Coast, and actually it's in Charles Murray has a new book called Coming Apart, where he replicates my quiz. And it's, if you're in the East Coast, do you know what oats look like? Do you know what soy looks like growing in the field? Do you know can you name a NASCAR driver? Can you name the start of hunting season? Can you look at a soldier's uniform and tell their military rank? It's a whole series of social segmentations. And people would fail at that. And so if you're on the East Coast, you probably don't know much about the Midwest or the South, though, my father-in-law was from Otter Tail, Minnesota, he went to New York City once in his life, and he was in a revolving door, and the leaves of the door folded in, and his first day, and he said, "That's it, I'm out of here." And so he never went back to New York. So I don't think he knows too much about New York. We used to have a lot to talk about. A monkfish or whatever fish he was eating out there in Minnesota. He was deep into that kind of fish, whatever it was. And so people are in their local areas, and that is a problem. We happen to be at a business where we travel a lot, and we're paid to pay attention to the whole country, but most people are reasonably segmented. But I would say two things. I do think the level of regional snobbery is actually decreasing a little as it becomes socially disgraceful to display it, to talk about flyover country. And the second thing, which I believe is, my son is at college in Indiana, at IU, and I go there a lot, 3 or 4 times a term, and every time somebody will come up to me at the airport or just on the street or if we're eating out with them, and they'll say, "What do you guys think of us in flyover country?" And I always feel like, you guys have an inferiority complex. Be proud. Like, why do you think people are looking down on you? They're not, as much as you feel it. And I do think that there's nothing, that the feeling of being looked down upon or being judged is stronger sometimes than the judging. And there's really no reason. And we, in New York and LA, our sin is pride, obviously. But we're not saying, I wonder what the folks in Iowa are thinking of us. That it doesn't happen. So at least you get that. I don't know.
See, it's the same problem for Red Sox fans. I'm a Red Sox fan, as is your moderator, as except when he's rooting for the Brewers, your county executive. That one of the things that bothers me about us is we can't get the damn Yankees out of our heads, and it's a real problem. I think we should just be. Now we're winning, so we should be happy.
Well, and I think there is no better evidence that we are the 7th most exciting city in America than this evening's discourse.
You were 4th before.
Yeah. If you invite us again, you'll be 16th.
Well, I see 2 last questions in the audience. We'll take one up front and one back there.
Foreign policy. What do you make of American foreign policy? Should it be changed? Is it inconsistent? What views do you have on it?
You each have 30 seconds.
Okay. I actually I'm to the right of Obama on most domestic issues, but on foreign policy, I give him reasonably high marks. I think he's been stuck with a series of issues that are just miserable issues, like Syria. It's just a miserable issue. Where the absence of a good option is evident. And so he's been wary. He's a very cautious guy. He is, on foreign policy, he's reasonably cautious and prudent. And where he's got a country that's broken and exhausted. And so I think he's taken a reasonably prudent approach that at least hasn't gotten us into any trouble. And while trying to manage some things, I think reasonably well. I think after 5 years of bad policy toward the Middle East, he really fixed that with his last trip. He had a great trip to Israel. I think on Libya, he did the right thing by preventing a massacre and helping getting rid of Gaddafi. I think on Iran, he's done quite a good job of really laying down the law and saying this is what we won't tolerate. We'll see if we end up tolerating it, but at least he's been clear. On China, I think a reasonably subtle policy of being tough while acknowledging we have trade ties. So I confess I'm reasonably impressed by how Obama's handled foreign policy.
Yeah, I'm broadly have the same view on that. I recently, there's a new book out by Richard Haass, who's president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and it's a book that makes, in certain sense, no sense for the president of the Council on Foreign Relations to write, because it's called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And Richard, who is a Republican who worked in the Bush administration but has come to believe and believed at the time, I think, that the Iraq War was a terrible mistake, basically argues that we have squandered a lot of resources in the last 10 years and a lot of our energy on foreign policy interventions that in the end didn't make us stronger. I mean, again, to be fair to him, he thinks Iraq was a mistake. He thinks going into Afghanistan was the right thing to do, but thinks the surge that President Obama began was a mistake, that we'd accomplished an end and we should not. He would have gone more with a kind of Biden-like, let's focus on terrorism policy. But I think that we do need to be more cautious in intervening in the world, not because I believe in American decline. I'm very anti-declinist. I love the Churchill line, many of you know, America always does the right thing after first exhausting all of the other possibilities. And I don't think we're in decline. And as Richard argues, I don't think China is destined to dominate the world in the next 10 or 20 years, or even necessarily in the long run. We're still a very rich, very powerful, very creative, very entrepreneurial country. But we do need to get our house in order at home. And this is where there's an overlap between David and me, because I do think we need to invest in the next generation. We need to help people in the workforce be able to take the jobs that take the jobs that are going to be there. We need to. We went from 4th to I think it was 25th, 5th to 25th or something like that in terms of our infrastructure compared to the rest of the world. So I think the world will still be interested in us. We are still going to be out there. We should be out there. But I think that we need a period to get ourselves strong again, because it is true that the United States has been strong in the world precisely because it's been so strong economically and socially at home. And I think we got to get to a point again where all of us, whatever our party, could agree, we have that strength again. So I believe foreign policy right now really does begin at home.
Before we get to our last question from the audience, let me engage in a brief bit of shameless self-promotion. Highlights from tonight's onstage conversation will air on Lake Effect, the show I produce at Milwaukee Public Radio, on Monday morning at 10. So let's, that's 89.7 WUWM.
I didn't realize that. Can I take back half of my remarks?
I want a tote bag.
I'm sure that $5 that you rescued went straight to your local public radio station. Let's go to one last question from the audience.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for coming, obviously. But last question, my question for you is on your industry, as opposed to the other topics tonight, and the condition of your industry. As a very young person, I grew up watching Walter Cronkite. And if Uncle Walter said it was true, it was true. As a college student, I watched the marvel of Woodward and Bernstein's investigative reporting and the incredible work they did to bring forward the truth. But today, as an older man, watching the media and watching the state of our politics, I feel very much at loss and a confidence in the media across the board. For a lot of reasons, and some of which may not be the fault of the media. It may be the advent of technology, the advent of Twitter, blogs, cable news, 24-hour news cycle, and trying to keep up with that. My personal impression is the media has suffered because they have lost the investigative reporting patience to dig out the truth and report the truth, as opposed to getting the soundbite, running with it, and getting on, making the news for that evening. And finally, I would say, as a general public, I think we unfortunately have suffered because the media has always represented the public in the political domain. They kept the feet of the political elected officials to the fire, so to speak, to make sure they stayed in line and did the right thing. But today it seems like it's a lot more, the media actually is tilting towards partisan, depending on who you watch. So you both may disagree or agree, but I'd be very curious in your opinion, and I do hope, by other questions, I'm curious whether you think the media can someday get back to their prior position of trust with the public back in the days of Walter Cronkite.
Go ahead. No, we're doomed on that front, too. I guess I'd say, I'm running through my mind as you were speaking of all the different parts of the media, which are stronger, which are weaker. It's clear that the evening news, the network news, is weaker. It's not as good as it was. and it never will be. That's a slowly declining sector. It's clear that, to me, that most mid-sized dailies are not as good as they were and not as well funded as they were. If you're at the Philadelphia Inquirer, the LA Times, a lot of the mid-sized dailies, it's just a miserable time to be in that industry. As for our papers, we're actually, I think we're actually better than ever. If you had asked me 2 years ago, I thought it was the whaling industry. I thought we were in complete collapse. But one of the things we're learning is you can get people to pay for online content. So for the first time in my newspaper's history, we have more money coming in through circulation than we do from advertising. And I think the quality of the journalism, and I've gone back and looked at the old papers, and you can be nostalgic for it, but I think the quality is higher now than it was, except for the op-ed page, obviously. And then I would say there's been an explosion of specialty publications. If you care about healthcare, go to the Kaiser Healthcare website. If you care about nitty-gritty politics, go to Politico. If you care about economics, I can name a whole series of economic blogs that are giving quality much better than anything that was offered popularly before. We're even beginning to reduce some of the devastation in the investigative journalism field. So a lot of foundations are now funding investigative journalism, which is a tremendously expensive thing to do. So, I think there's ups and downs. I wouldn't say it's complete collapse. And as for the general problem in the country is we've got a lack of trust in all institutions. It's hard to think of an institution, except for the military, that has not suffered a decline in trust. And is that because they're all worse? Maybe in some cases, or because we're just a less trusting society than we used to be. I think that's certainly true. So I think we have our ups and downs, but I do think if you have the patience and the time to look for quality on the web, you can find awesome quality on the web, along with a lot of, Washington Post columnists. But
when you think back to Walter Cronkite, you're thinking back to a time where, as David said, there was more trust in institutions across the board, and there was a lot more political consensus, and that most people were drawing their news from either a local paper or three major networks, with some watching PBS. And politics, the old line politics was played within the 40-yard lines. We did have the divisions of Vietnam, obviously, in that period. Now we've got parties playing in different stadiums. And so I think that Walter Cronkite was a great journalist, but I don't think it was about Cronkite. I think it was about the circumstance you're in. What I am really worried, and secondly, on partisan media, our history as a nation is of having partisan media. We actually got accustomed in our over several generations to something quite different. If you look around the country and see its surviving newspapers, a lot have Democrat or Republican in the title. A few still have Whig in the title. One of my goals is to have my column appear in every remaining Whig paper in the United States. And that went back to the day when the press was partisan. So in a way, what we've done is we've returned to our past in the current circumstance. What really worries me is the declining ability of news organizations to support basic reporting. You have many fewer people covering state governments all over the country. You have fewer people covering City Hall. You have fewer people walking the hallways at agencies. And, we talk a lot about investigative reporting. A lot of the check on corruption comes from people who are at a place day after day. And the person down the hall who knows there's stealing going on in another office can pull that a reporter aside and say, I don't want my name on it, but you got to see what's going on in that room back there. And sure enough, that reporter can report on corruption. And when the person isn't there, the eyes aren't there, the person isn't there to turn to, we've got a problem. And that's what worries me, is the support for core reporting capacity. And it's good that you know, the paywall is working at the New York Times. But it's still not the kind of revenue that newspapers got because they used to be monopoly. They had monopoly profits financing a public good, which was journalism. And I think we got a ways to go before we sort that out. But there is National Public Radio. And I'm pandering to our host, but I also, NPR is a really interesting model because, you know, everybody talks about the government share. The government share is about 15%, as I remember. And I do think it provides an interesting model for other forms of journalism, that it kind of, you know, not-for-profit journalism or, you know, cooperative journalism where profit goes back into the organization. You know, I'm curious if that can work in any other form, because NPR has been a growing medium at a time when so many others are shrinking. So maybe we can learn something more broadly from NPR.
Well, I hope so. Well, and we talk about it as really the ultimate in accountability, because at a local level, if people don't think we're doing a good job, the pledges stop coming in, and it's sort of an instant poll that way. But as much as it pains me to say this, the time has flown by, and more of it has flown by than initially planned. But before we wrap up, please let's give a warm round of applause and thanks to David Brooks and E.J. Dionne.
Thank you. Here, let me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Mitch and David and E.J., thank you very, very much for a wonderful discussion tonight. You have modeled for us what the Public Policy Forum is all about, which is rational, informed, sane discussion of policy issues. So thank you so very much for that. We appreciate your time with us and your visit with us tonight. Thank you all for supporting the Public Policy Forum and being here tonight. And this is very important. When you leave tonight, as you're walking out our front door and looking at that beautiful stained glass beehive above the door, be sure to pick up your gift bag, which will be down there for you. It will have in it autographed copies of both David and E.J.'s latest books. And if you if you don't have one, also the history of the Public Policy Forum that was written by Jeff Benthoff will be available for you as well. Thank you for being here with us tonight. Thank you for your support of the Public Policy Forum. Good night.